Hi class, I think I've got my act mostly together here on these videos, so will be the first video PowerPoint presentation for lesson plan number 2. And it covers chapter 5, which is all about e-commerce security and payment systems. Before we talk about that though, let me briefly go over the how I'm going to handle the seminar assessments going forward. So what I'm going to do is pose a question at the beginning of each of the PowerPoint audios that will compose a component of the overall seminar assessment that you'll hand in at the end of the learning plan. The directions for the first one are given here. It's a decent question. It's from your text, and it really tests your knowledge of most aspects of Chapter 5. I thought the lead-in topic of cyber war was a really interesting one. It's very relevant. We don't hear a lot about it. It's going on constantly. There are attacks, thousands of attacks every day worldwide, from various parties on various entities, all with different motives and intended outcomes. Sometimes we want systems to crash, sometimes we want to watch, sometimes we want to steal. So rather than me talking about this at great length, I've given you 2 hacking related videos. One's a TED Ed video, so it's typical for those of you that watch TED Ed, 60 minutes long, gives you great insight into how things can be hacked. This other one, MSN.com, I actually found it today when I logged in on the web, and they're both good. They're both good. I'll call them reads. Why are we concerned about hacking in respect to e-commerce? Well, it's huge. As the book says, it's hard to estimate, but the actual costs are substantial. We hear about it from the likes of Target, and the cost can be overt. In other words, they can measure it in terms of money stolen, or it becomes more qualitative but somewhat quantitative when you talk about lost customers, the matter of lost trust. This actually is an interesting TED Ed video as well on the matter of hacking. It's a very different twist than the other one. It basically says that hacking is one of the reasons, or one of the motives rather, for increased security and improved way that we do business, which is an interesting perspective. I mean, I agree with it. At the same time, it would imply to me that it's in a company's best interest, perhaps, to covertly pay hackers, let's say, to hack into systems of potential customers as a motive to get them to buy your products. I think that this table from your text is a good one as far as framing the issue of cybersecurity from both a customer's perspective and a merchant's perspective. So I'd say take a look at that and read it carefully. It may help you in your take on answering the question posed at the beginning for your seminar assessment. There are 3 points of vulnerability, as your book points out, in your system: the client's information, the server itself, and then the communications pipeline. In a typical email transaction, there are a number of points of contact and intersection. And essentially all of those are vulnerable to attack. And you get into one system, you can get in to other systems as well. So a vulnerability at one, it's sort of your weakest link. Is your worst player is as good as you are. The book lays out a number of different kinds of security threats, and when you hit that part of the text, you'll want to slow down, because it is at these sections of your text that I think will be most helpful in answering the question that we posed at the beginning of the chapter. So I thought your book did a really good job of identifying a myriad of different types of potential threats and explaining them in detail for a layman. So take a look at those as you go through your text. So in preparing protecting our system, there are 2 primary ways of doing that: firewalls and proxy servers. And I would imagine each of exactly as they're portrayed in this particular graphic, that a firewall sits in front of your network of computers, and information coming into your system or going out of your system runs through these firewalls, which again can be hardware or software or a combination of those. You can also have a series of firewalls, each of which necessarily targets a different kind of malware, like a virus versus a Trojan horse or something like that. A proxy server is, look at it as the gatekeeper for your system. All the information that comes into your system or goes out through your system goes through this proxy server, which monitors, again, the type of information that's coming in or going out. When we think about security, you want to think of it in 2 contexts: obviously what's coming into your system, but also what's going out of the system. Because if you had a local area network, like we talked about earlier, a wide area network, one way to get information out of that closed system is for an employee, let's say, to physically take it to a system or a computer that's hooked into the internet and then send it out. So that's one thing that the proxy server does, is monitor employee information that's going in, employee information that's being sent out, and taking a look at it and monitoring it, or looking at what kind of information the employee is looking at while they're logged in to the internet. So there are systems that monitor employee activity in that context, like, is this person spending their day looking at pornography or something like that, and a proxy server would monitor that activity. So there are different kinds of software and different kind of hardware that you want to be aware of. There's a lot of different kind of companies that specialize in cybersecurity, like FireEye and Symantec. They're both very good companies, publicly traded companies whose expertise lies directly in this matter. So what should a company do in order to protect themselves from outside attacks or even inside compromise of information that should be secure? Well, they should have a security plan, And there are 5 steps in that: risk assessment, security, policy implementation, plan, creating a security organization, and then performing a security audit. And that's really an ongoing process. It's created new expertise within a company, most of which probably falls under the auspices of the Chief Information Officer. So the first step is to perform an audit. What do we need? What are the risks at hand? Develop a security policy that could include purchase or identification of technology that's needed, as well as include who will have accessibility to what kinds of information or what kinds of hardware within the system. And then you develop an implementation plan that's a matter of employee policy, as well as let's say purchase and installation of hardware. You create a security organization, quite possibly. That could be a person that's responsible for it within a small company, or an actual organization or subunit within, say, the information auspices. The companies I've worked for that are big enough to have this, it fell within, actually under the, it wasn't a chief information officer, it was an information officer, technology officer, under the auspices of the accountant for the company, which was the chief financial officer. I had to kind of take a second to grasp it again. Anyway, and then at the end you would perform a security audit from time to time to test whether or not your system is managing as it should be, and then if and in it's not, and it almost certainly changes over time, then you start the whole process again. Real quickly, e-commerce payment systems are of large concern. Most of the payment system occurs through credit cards or debit cards. I would tell you real quickly, I'm not an expert on this by any stretch, but of the so-so amount of information that I've gathered from people who have had problems with their personal information being stolen, it usually comes when they're traveling using debit cards instead of credit cards. And I've read some stuff that says when you're traveling, it's better to use credit cards than it is debit cards, or debit cards to try to get cash out of machines, because those kinds of machines, like ATM machines, for example, are often hacked. I'm not saying you should do that. I'm just saying that's what I've heard. So as a consequence of different kinds of consumer information being stolen, there is alternative means of payment being developed. Companies like Amazon and Apple are almost acting like banks themselves, coming up with their own ways for payment. This has led to digital kinds of currencies being developed as well, like Bitcoin, which we'll talk about in a second. More and more, though, I would expect that mobile phones will be used as a payment device, because they can be monitored for a number of different reasons, including identifying underground economy activity, payment for drugs, any kind of payment can be monitored and identified and audited at a later date. So again, some of these currencies like Bitcoin are meant to avoid that sort of thing, and in fact it came to light because it was an underground currency being used for purchases of illegal drugs and being shipped shipped internationally. I'm not going to explain what Bitcoin is, but here is a TED-Ed video that I've watched that is a really good one. So for those of you that want to know a little bit about Bitcoin, I would recommend this one. Like all the videos and article sites that I've posted in this PowerPoint presentation, they are not required for you to watch. They are rather suggested to keep these presentations shorter and to augment lecture as a tool. And finally, I have posted you won't see this very often from me, but a Wikipedia URL to explain electronic billing presentment and payment EBPP. So that's all I have for this, and I'll be talking to you soon. Thanks.